Rebecca is a co-founder and director of Sex Matters. She is a solicitor specialising in equal pay and workplace discrimination. She has researched, written and presented on the law around sex and gender reassignment, presented her paper on the impact of gender recognition reform on sex-based rights at the Scottish Parliament in February 2020, and published articles in the top-tier UK law journal. And she participates in the lawyers' collective Legal Feminist. Rebecca.
Okay, so as we did before, can you hear me at the back? Brilliant. Okay, so Sex Matters is something of a controversial statement at the moment. And that would be an understatement. We are looking forward to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, that's the EHRC, providing us with new guidance, hopefully very soon, on single-sex services. Sex Matters is a collective. Well, no, we're a company limited by guarantee, but we are actually experts now in this particular area of law. And we have 3 questions that the EHRC needs to ask itself, and we've provided some suggestions as to those answers. And we also have 10 principles which it should keep in mind when it's developing that guidance. The current requirement for case-by-case individualised assessment as to whether somebody of the opposite sex can access a single-sex service is an incorrect understanding of the law, and it's not practical. The good news is that this can be sorted out. It's the EHRC's job, and we're here to watch them and make sure that they get it right. So, first off, 3 questions I promised you, and we do know the answer to those questions. The first, is it reasonable for people using single-sex spaces to expect a single-sex environment? And I think we all know the answer is yes. I made it easy for you. Does the Equality Act give some people the right to access services for the opposite sex?
No.
Turn this into a panto. I think I might have to give you all the mic. So the third question, what should service providers do? We say that there's 3 principles here. There'll be 10 later, but respect, clarity, clear policies, and necessity. Is it really necessary to have a single-sex service all the time, or can we provide something that is unisex? I apologise for any colonial references which I may be about to make. Service providers, frontline staff and service users should not need to be biologists. Nobody needs a degree in biology to decide on how to provide a single-sex service. They're routine, they're lawful, they're not exceptional. Members of the opposite sex should not be admitted. So now let's move on to the 10 principles. The first is coherence. Definitions in law should be consistent. Everybody should understand them. You should not need to be a lawyer to understand them. And the really important words which we need to have a commonality of understanding amongst ourselves with service providers, in government, everywhere you care to go. Man, woman, male, female, single sex, opposite sex, mixed sex. This should not be difficult. And that brings me to my second principle. Keep it simple, stupid. We don't need exceptional circumstances in order to be able to expect a single-sex provision. Building and workplace regulations allow separate washing and toilet facilities for the inclusion of women in society and in the workplace. You don't need specialist training. You don't need to be a vet. You don't need to be a biologist. You don't need to be a lawyer. If we were to go down the road of case-by-case decision-making, you're going to make it difficult. You're going to make it onerous. You're going to put frontline staff in awkward situations. And you're going to discriminate. And this is possible. That's our third principle. This is not mission impossible. Staff and service users need to understand single-sex services. Adults and kids. Speakers of English as a second language. People with low literacy. Those with learning disabilities. Policies have to be communicable. They have to be consistent. We don't want loopholes. They shouldn't be exploitable. And where possible, people ought to know in advance if they're going into a single-sex environment or a mixed-sex environment. Our fourth principle, I've called it lookism. Really, it's sexism. Passing doesn't work. Currently, the EHRC thinks that the gender that someone presents as is good enough. We say that's sexist. High heels do not a woman make. Women can wear their hair short, and nobody should say to her, "You look like a man." Nobody meets these gendered presentation standards. They're discriminatory, they're sexist, they're lookist. And just because some people break sex-based rules and get into single-sex spaces unobserved doesn't mean that we should accept sexist rules. Our fifth principle is to keep it secular. Some people believe trans women are women. Many don't. Some of us believe that sex matters. The belief humans can't change sex and that sex is important is, say it with me, worthy of respect in a democratic society. Thank you, Maya Forstatter, Anya Palmer, Ben Cooper QC. No one should be forced to pretend to believe in gender identity or forced to pretend they don't value single-sex spaces or forced to participate in mixed-sex services or going to mixed-sex environments, and particularly not unwittingly. And then we move on to secrets. I don't like secrets. Every time we go into a single-sex service or a single-sex space, we make a declaration of sex, whether or not we do it in words or by our deeds, simply by entering into the room. People who try to meet sexist, lookist presentation standards might find that uncomfortable, but that's the case. We don't need to be looking at gender recognition certificates, medical conditions, treatments or surgeries. We just ask people to make that declaration themselves. And where that is really unnecessary, alternative spaces should be available, if possible. And that takes us on to 7 quite neatly. No checks. We don't think checks are necessary. It's not practical to check whether or not somebody's got a certificate that allows them into a room. Generally, we go by perception. And it's generally accurate. Sometimes there will be misunderstandings. They're genuine misunderstandings. And even when more intimate details are known by an organisation, as in prisons, it still doesn't make sense to break sex-based rules. Misunderstandings, neither will they break the system of a sex-based rule. And now we're going to move on to dignity. Allowing people into opposite-sex services creates shock and embarrassment. There's the case of Taylor and Jaguar Land Rover, where a non-binary male employee was allowed to use female loos and then faced questions and comments from other employees, which were experienced as hostile. The EHRC has already suggested that unisex provision should have been a possibility in that instance. So why not put that into their guidance? And then we move on to what we think, and that's why we set up this company, sex matters. Single-sex services matter in places where sex matters. And they're based on information about sex. It's not logical to access a single-sex service whilst maintaining that information about your sex should be kept private. If you really do want to keep that information private, then surely case-by-case assessment is far more invasive. Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights gives everyone the right to respect for private, family, life, home and correspondence. Apart from, because there are exceptions, where justified for national security, public safety, prevention of crime, protection of health, protection of rights and freedoms of others. And that's where you see that exception is going to work and should work in the instance of single-sex services. And then we are going to move on to our last principle, which is that gender recognition certificates are not a licence. Organisations only should be considering rights, not fulfilling desires. The EHRC, we think, has got this wrong, and I quote, their position, they say, has consistently been that there are rights and interests which require balancing. The EHRC recognises that trans people, with and without gender recognition certificates, have rights and interests in being able to access services of their required gender. We say that's a misunderstanding. Trans status does not confer rights to access to single-sex spaces. Everyone with a protected characteristic should be included within society, but that doesn't mean inclusion into opposite-sex spaces. Thank you very much.